Another question we get asked in certain types of diagnoses that we see in hospice is, would it be beneficial for us to consider putting in a feeding tube, or what some people refer to as a PEG tube? That's a big conversation in and of itself. I think that, when those questions are asked, we know in our culture that eating and food are very important. There is this belief, and I think we carry that as we're growing up, that when you're ill and you don't feel well, you gotta have nourishment to get better. And when somebody is declining in their disease, they typically are not real hungry. Their bodies are trying to conserve energy, and they may not really feel much like eating. That's counter to what the family who's sitting there saying, "Dad, please, you gotta eat, you gotta get your strength back. You want to go fishing this year. You gotta eat. If you don't eat, you won't put weight on, you won't be able to get stronger." So then the question comes up from the family, well, Dad's not listening to us. Is there a way that we can get around that by just putting a feeding tube in his stomach, and then we can give him a full course meal directly into his stomach? So I think when those questions are asked, those questions then deserve frank conversation. Conversation first and foremost would be, if the patient's able to participate in the conversation, what does he or she want? What are their wishes? Have they made a living will? Do they have a POLST form completed where it outlines that they would not want a feeding tube? And I think that if that's the case, then we have ongoing conversations with the family to try to get them to better understand some of the risks that occur with putting a feeding tube in. And those risks would include an increased risk in aspiration pneumonia and other kinds of infection. It's a procedure. While it's done as an outpatient, it still has a risk associated with it. The other thing that we're honest about is that for those patients that typically are declining and losing weight from their disease process, there really are not any good studies that would indicate that putting a feeding tube in really lengthens the person's overall prognosis, that they gained significant amount of weight, which allows them to become stronger, and it alters or improves their overall length of time on this earth. So the studies are pretty clear, not only those studies that have looked at insertion of feeding tubes for end-stage Alzheimer's patients or dementia patients, but other types of neurological conditions where, or even malignancy conditions where the patient is not eating or drinking and the loved one is attempting to get around the mouth ingestion by putting the food directly into the stomach. Overall, I try to discourage that, but certainly it's a choice that the patient and family need to make. But I think it's part of our responsibility as palliative and hospice physicians and providers to be honest with patients, to make sure that they understand those trade-offs, that despite it appearing that it would make a difference, that they would gain weight, they would gain strength, they would be able to live longer. The reality for most patients is that it puts them at greater risk to developing an infection like aspiration pneumonia and is unlikely to really alter or prolong their life. The other little cultural thing about eating, which is something that struck me a number of years ago in a patient that I saw, a home hospice patient. The patient had a significant neurological disorder, was actively declining and was no longer able to take nourishment by mouth. The son, who was the primary caregiver, was very distressed over this decline in his mom's oral intake and wanted something done, and talked to one of our nurses about, what else could be done, a feeding tube, an IV for some hydration things like that. So the nurse had asked if I would go out and see the patient. The son graciously was willing to meet with me. And the short version of a very long conversation I had with the son was, to me, a moment that I'll never forget. He and I talked about his concerns about his mother's decline and the fact that she had had a few days where she had stopped eating and drinking. And I asked him, when we talked about the options that would be available, feeding tube versus an IV with intravenous fluids, what each of those would look like, what the pros and cons would be for each of those, and you know, the pluses and the minuses, the benefits, the trade-offs. He didn't want to, this particular gentleman didn't want to take his mother to the hospital or an outpatient facility to have a feeding tube, but he was very much wanting something done. I struggled because I knew there was something else that he just wasn't sharing with me. So I said, what do you hope to gain from the intravenous fluids? That's what he sort of finally settled on, in terms of, he didn't want to do the feeding tube, he wanted to pursue the IV fluids. What do you hope to gain? He said, well, in my culture, it is important for us to be prepared for our next step in our journey. That preparation also requires us to have our lunch boxes filled. So he caught me off guard when he said our lunch box is full or filled. What struck me, though, was what he was getting at is he felt that his mother would not be able to take her last couple steps in her journey because her lunchbox, her body, was not filled. So what we decided to do in this unique situation was start a very, very slow rate for an IV with some sugar water. And I explained to him that one of the things that he was likely to see as her lunchbox got filled was some increase in swelling of her arms and feet. That would indicate that, you know, her kidneys are really not able to sort of handle that extra fluid because her journey was really slowing down. But we characterized the conversation that, and he understood where I was going with this. In some ways, it meant to him, if he saw that extra fluid appearing, her lunchbox was probably filled. We got to that point within 24 hours, and he asked that the IV fluids be discontinued. Within the next day, she passed away peacefully.